Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome to another Sunday Supplement Live. Joined almost as always, it's been summer, so we've had a couple of missing partners here, but we've got Adam Lawrence, we have Helen Chorley, number 2 apparently, we didn't get the number 1 today, and we have Piotr Ruzanek alongside myself, Jay Howard, where we start a conversation that will go in any direction where no one knows how we started it and where we ended in reality. But we normally start with Adam's 5,000-word discourse on the economy, property, and life itself, the supplement. I think it was quite numbers heavy this time around. We really went in deep there.
There was a mere, I teased you last night, didn't I, with a 3,780 word count release, pre-word count release, which only 3 to 4 people in the world are interested in and know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I wanted to do a bit around exactly why I actually think we're at the number 1 opportunity moment for some time in buying and holding property. Because what today's effort does really is it shows, do you know what, last decade, it really wasn't that exciting at all, unless you were in one of the real hot spots. And I've had a bit of a bugbear over the years with people. I mean, look, we all know gurus will claim anything to grab a bit of fame, but people who sort of happen to land in London or Cambridge or Oxford or whatever, and then claim that they're some kind of fantastic property investor because the market's carried them forward, you know? Whereas I've got maximum respect for people who've geographically flexed to go where they think the action might be, as a really good tactic. But look, the 2010s weren't that exciting. The last couple of years have been pretty exciting, but my underpinning view behind all of this is there's still plenty of inflation yet to come. And that means action, opportunity, erosion of debt, which is a good thing for anybody carrying more debt than they are cash or credit, ultimately. And whilst it's been a bit of a reasonable borrower's decade with interest rates very, very low, the next few years could be even better for borrowers if you've got your debt structure right. And I think I've spent that much time sort of talking about recessions and being a bit bearish, not on property, but on the future of the economy, I think, generally speaking. The other thing that started to happen in the last sort of 10 days or so is I've started to see a path through whereby recession isn't the only answer, and something different does happen. Now, you can package that up in 50 different ways, but in reality, it's the only way it ever happens when it's governmentally inspired. And that's kicking the can down the road, kicking the rugby ball to the end of the field and seeing what happens, and not dealing with the problems that are inherent. And I know we've talked before, Jay, you said last week about 2008 not being worked through the system yet. I wonder if we went back far enough, if we could argue that leaving the ERM hasn't worked through the system yet, to be honest. Possibly we can, but you know, there's so much yet to come, in my view, with inflation and the issues that we're going to face on that over the next few years. But what's really changed is the chat. We've had all these distractions, and we've had, you know, chatter around who the next PM is and stuff like that. Truss is now 1 to 12 or something like that. It looks home and hosed. She's done her best to try and cock it up, and she's still not seeming to be cocking it up. So she's going to get the gig. And then you're going to see the typical politicians vault fast, because what everybody, I think, can agree on at the moment, while they might not be quite as theatric as Martin Lewis, is that we're on the eve of something that looks like a poll tax moment. You know, I've started hearing in the last week the words general strike. Now that is bigger than the 70s. That is really, really, really big stuff. And no one is going to want social unrest to that sort of level. And I think Starmer's idea about freezing the energy cap will cost, they theorise, would cost something like 26 billion, which wouldn't be a number that would have been entertained 5 years ago in any way, shape or form. But I think if you said to Truss or the Conservative Party in general, what's your budget for winning the next election, right? Given that it's not your money anyway, I'm talking about what's the UK's budget for the Conservatives staying in power. 1 to 200 billion wouldn't be outside of what they would quite happily spend, as long as they don't, you know, as long as it looks like they've invested it or done their best to avert serious crisis. So, you know, we've got some major bailing out, regardless of Liz saying she doesn't like handouts or whatever. There's going to be some handouts. There's going to be some stuff done. It's a bit like looking at the pandemic on about April the 1st, when it was kind of like you're holding your breath. You're not sure what's going to happen. You know that governments are going to do some things. You don't know what they are. It was very difficult. I certainly didn't see anybody, any economic commentator that I listened to, read, any Bloomberg, anyone who thinks completely off the wall and says their own stuff, who said there'll be a furlough scheme, for example. But there was a furlough scheme, and that was a Conservative government. So, you know, Liz is the continuity candidate. What's on the table here? Renationalisation. I put a comment on a post of Quasey's the other day that said, if it was me, I would freeze the energy price cap. That will crash the price of the energy companies. Then I'd renationalise them. But then the public sector doesn't think like that, but the private sector does ultimately. You know, bit of a George Soros play, really. You know, you can't fire those bullets over and over again. But ultimately, the government gets away with murder. You know, what does it? How did tax begin 400 years ago? You know, you got everybody together and said, there's some really rich people, you know, and they can afford a lot. They can afford a lot of stuff. So we'll just take a little bit off them, and then we'll distribute it amongst everybody else. And then the scope creep. And of course, that's what we're seeing at the moment. Let's not forget, technically, personal allowances and almost every tax allowance that you have across the board are frozen until 2026. Now, no one's talking about that. The government's absolutely cock a hoop about that, because it's going to raise something like 132 billion in extra tax revenue, just down to the predicted level of inflation, which in my view is too low. And there's going to be more inflation than that. So you could be talking 250 to 300 billion of extra real terms tax take because of these frozen thresholds. Now, I think we know these thresholds are not going to be frozen, realistically, even if that's cynically, politically to win elections rather than anything else, right? But when you put that sort of number in context, 26 billion for freezing the energy cap, maybe isn't so bad. And ultimately, you know, people, and this is it's all politics, isn't it? You know, the amount of union boss stuff that's in the headlines at the moment. At the end of the day, they're politicians. You know, they speak from the heart and they really believe what they say. But they're politicians as well. So there's all this politicking going on. And I'm not saying freezing the cap is the way forward, although I do like the idea of freezing and then renationalising, just because it appeals to the opportunist in me, let's say. I was surprised to read 2/3 of the Conservative Party membership agrees with renationalising the energy companies at this time. Probably temporarily rather than permanently, because I think you need the market to work all this out. But an interesting thing that someone told me this week at our pit meeting in Manchester, a friend of theirs is going mad for wind turbines at the moment, racking up wind turbines and using battery storage solutions so that they can harvest the wind energy and then sell it back into the grid. There was a point about 3 weeks ago when we were paying Belgium £3,900 per gigawatt hour for electricity because we were so short of our own generation. And if you remember EDF and Hinkley Point, there was absolute blue murder when I think the government agreed to pay EDF £86 a gigawatt hour. And people said, well, that's just ridiculous. We should never be paying anything like that for electricity. That contract today looks utter genius, unless it's got CPI in it. But even if it's got CPI, you know, energy inflation's 160%, 160 in the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, in an incredibly developed country. There's big stuff about to happen. But the point overall is there's a couple of worked examples in there of, even if you're a plank and you've sat there and bought a property and you bought it at the market, you went into the agents with your deposit or with your dip or whatever you did, bought a property and rented it out. You've put in some 50 to 60% real terms performance over the last 2.5 years. We shouldn't be expecting that to be replicated. But if you can get your debt structure and your financial structure right, there's one hell of a roadmap of opportunity ahead in the next 2.5 years. Phenomenal. And I'll breathe.
I rest my case, Your Honour. It's a really interesting one. I think the nationalisation of the energy companies would be interesting, but I don't know how much of a saving depending on which government or which person's in, you'd get passed on. That would be a difficult one. And I remember reading somewhere, or maybe you had said it. I'm not sure who had said it, but I've definitely read it somewhere. Is that even the North Sea oil is sold by the dollar instead of by the pound? So even if we had more control over that, we still have the pound dollar discrepancy that kind of shorts us out as well.
Oh wow!
Such is the might of the petrodollar. Absolutely.
Yeah,
and like in Poland, some of the gas and basically fuel companies are like mostly owned by the like government, and I mean the, what do you call this, treasury, right? And still they're taking record profits, and they're using those profits to buy media companies and some other things. And there's a lot of thing going on that it's just basically, even though there are profits and they're not kind of, things are not distributed as you would imagine if companies were owned by the government.
Wouldn't you love to hear the boardroom conversation around acquiring some relevant horizontal assets that may or may not include media companies? I mean, says a lot, doesn't it, really? I don't know why we're not addressing the profit situation in the energy companies by one of the things that I liked that Sunak did was the super deduction when he did the COVID budget, and the idea of over encouraging investment, if you like. Now, why would you not have like a mega deduction for energy company profits rather than windfall taxing them, right? Why not give them a mega deduction for everything they invest in renewables within the next 12 months or 24 months? So you shorten the time horizon and you give them a 200% discount on the corporation tax. So they can basically like cut their tax bill in a third or something, because their tax bills will be fairly significant, and get them to do more renewable investment now. It won't help tomorrow. It won't help October, but it's one way, surely, of just forcing the issue forwards. And, you know, I was thinking about this in the way that my brain works, because I was staying in a hotel last night, and it's a beautiful old Georgian building. You know, in the bathroom, it slopes down like that. And not because it's a deliberate wet room, you know, because it's moved over the years or whatever. It's got sash windows throughout that are like tracing paper as far as keeping heat in or out, or sound in or out, or whatever, which probably can't be touched because of conservation or listing or whatever. And you just think, you know, they've done a nice job with it. You know, they've brought it forward into the somewhat modern era. But every asset that is sweated, which the vast majority of assets in business are sweated, is underinvested in at the end of the day. If we bought that today, we would go hell for leather in doing everything. Then we would refinance it at its very best point, and then we would start to sweat it. And in 10 years' time, we'd probably be under-investing in it. That's just the natural organic cycle of business. Once something is making profits, you know, what's one of the reasons why Monzo and Starling and Tide and whoever else can really come in and make a difference? Because if you go into RBS or HSBC, their computer systems would be 20 plus years old, and 20 years in computing is 150 years in building, let's face it. And so they've got all these legacy issues. If you start a new company, you haven't got the legacy issues. You buy the newest kit, it's all virtual servers and this, that, and the other, and you haven't got those problems. So, you know, that cycle kind of perpetuates, and that's why you've seen and that's what, you know, people criticize the private sector and the public sector for underinvesting, but it's the nature of the beast. You know, you can't, the public sector's grown in terms of jobs 7.5% in the last 2.5 years. Now, obviously, COVID has had a massive part to play in that, and some of those still need to grow, but some of those jobs need to go, and they need to be rationalized. So I'm not calling for austerity as a philosophy, but I am calling for a sensible attitude towards some of these things that have popped up, because we all know, you know, some of the resources that were deployed during the pandemic for various things. You know, there are people who work as track and trace operators on the phone, you know, operating in a virtual call center of 200 people, where they managed about 4 calls a day total. it's utterly ridiculous. And that's the sort of level of wastage that can happen in an inefficient and bureaucratic, and public sector is not meant to change quickly. So when it does, it can't react. Whereas on the flip side, the attitude towards the NHS during the pandemic in terms of funding was pretty much the taps are fully turned on, which is what needed to happen. But the problem is right now, shutting them off then means you've got winter crisis mode in 25-degree heat in August. So we're nowhere near at the back end of some of the problems, but some of them need the red pen taken to them. And as usual, just like the energy situation in housing in general, there's no congruency and there's no thought leadership and there's no architecture in the framework. And it's just instead it's just a bit of a giggle who, we're 14 housing ministers in a row of people who aren't surveyors, not that it should be a surveyor, but just anyone, an estate agent, and I don't care, someone who understands something about the housing market. But instead, it's someone, not even a jack of all trades, a Sid of all trades, if you like, rather than a jack of all trades. Jack being higher qualified than Sid, is called.
Well, I had a rant about this in one of the Sunday specials, right? Didn't I? I was like, well, it doesn't matter what you. Like most politicians have got a degree in politics or economy or classics or something like that, right? But they just give the position to whichever mate sucked them off last time. Do you know what I mean? It's whoever the biggest buddy is. So then you have a bunch of people in an environment where all they do is they're like, well, how can I leave my mark? Right? Well, how can I satisfy my ego? What will I be known for? Not what's best for the country. Not what.
How do I get to the next rung on the ladder? How do I get to the next rung on the ladder?
And your point about congruency is brilliant, because there is none. There is none. I mean, even if you take the fact that Labour were in government for a long time and Conservatives have been in government for a long time, they both had 10, 15 years of it. That's a good period of time. There has been almost no progression. The only thing that's progressed is the market and the elements of the market that are completely out of their control.
Yeah, exactly. And the problems that there were in 1997 in terms of undersupply, for example, all they've done is they've just exacerbated and completely run away from. It's really quite bad to it's insanely and utterly ridiculous. And I said in the supplement, it's unfixable. No one could come in under the current structure and make it. You could go in the right direction, which we're not doing, and we haven't done for 30 years, but you couldn't fix it. It's unfixable, and it's just.
I saw an interview with Elon Musk, and I cast no aspersions as to whether you like, dislike, appreciate, not appreciate, whatever it is.
All of the above. All of the above.
Well, yeah, he's that kind of character, right? He was asked recently in an interview. He said, and someone said to him, "What do you think the most devastating thing is, or on the horizon to mankind, to people? What do you think it is?" And he said, "Population collapse." Ooh. So basically, globally, he's been looking at birth rates and death rates across the globe, and he thinks that there is a massive collapse. There's less and less people getting married, more and more people waiting until they're older to have children. And he said, but people aren't seeing this yet because people are living to a longer age. But he said, once that gap is mitigated, you're going to find that there is going to be a massive deficit in global population.
If you look at forecasts from the UN, this has varied over the last sort of 20 odd years, but they did see population peak at around 2050, and then it's somewhere between 2050 and 2100, and it's that kind of unpalatable. It's funny, I went to an interview many years ago with a Big Four consulting firm to potentially join their strategy consulting team. And one of the questions that the partner asked me was about, he used the example of Procter & Gamble, but I mean, it could be any of the big FMCG companies or whatever. And he said, you've got to go in and talk to the board on a strategic level at P&G, right? Where are their problems? Without me telling you any more than that, where do you think their current problems are? And what do you think the solutions to them are? And it's a pretty difficult question, especially if he's never worked in FMCG, never spoken to anyone at that level before. And I said, look, personally, I would start from the very long term, right? And I would say at this point, people like P&G go into markets like, pick a developing country, pick an African developing country that's very early on in its cycle of development. So, like less mature than in Nigeria or something like that, right? They go in, they flood the market with cost price or even loss leading products in order to get brand strength, because all they want to do is want to create coverage. These are the markets where population is still expanding at a very fast rate. Even in Nigeria, the population will double in the next 30 or 40 years, I think is the current rate of change, and it will be more populous than the US will be because of the phenomenon that you've just been talking about, Jay. And at some point, the world's going to stop growing in terms of population, and then it goes from a land grab style approach to things to a refine and make efficient, but not necessarily in a market that's as mature as the UK or the US or whatever you want to see. And then you come down to what do they need to do over the next 10 years and the next 5 years, and then you come down to what do they do over the next 3 months, sort of thing. And the guy said, that's really interesting. I've never seen anyone approach that question in a sort of top-down, distance-out methodology before. And he said, it gives me a really good insight into how your brain works. But he said, all that long-term stuff, he said, forget about it, because boards,
really
shareholders...
Sounds really nice, don't do it.
No, they're not interested in it. They're not interested in it. That's the reality of it. So he said, you could point towards it because they'd like to make some noises to say they agreed with that, but it won't change a single thing. So what they want to do is, how do they outperform Unilever in Brazil or Cuba or wherever the hell they are next quarter? Right. So focus on that. And I was like, that's he was very stark with it, and I thought it was very interesting insight into. I was like, well, I thought I'm supposed to be working in strategy, scanning the horizon, working out what might be coming. You know what I mean? But there you go. So you learn something every day.
Wow.
Yeah, indeed.
So you didn't take the job?
Do you know what? I didn't take the job, but primarily that was because it was. I was in my early 30s, so it's too late really, because they wanted me to do 60% Europe, 10% US, which wouldn't have been 10%, would it? It would have been more. And I just thought, nah. I already had a child and another one on the way, and thought, no, unless I'm a guaranteed divorce job, guaranteed divorce. That sounded like fun, but yeah, not that much fun, really, to be honest.
Strategy's loss is property's gain. A Sunday morning's gain as well. Exactly.
It was at the inflection point of taking property seriously. So yeah, it's nice to think that might be the case. It's interesting. I'll tell you what is also interesting though, is that I was listening last night. Finally, the idea that putting all the costs up for landlords, and the current flavor of the month is ESG and EPCs in our world, obviously, and compliance with all of that. And finally, the very base simple argument that if you put the price of being a landlord up, people will leave the market and or rents will rise, is actually coming through to fruition. Because we're seeing these rent rises, people are saying, well, of course there are these. Listen to these landlords. So there's a guy called Dan Latto who helps us out with some of our marketing stuff across a few businesses. He's a good guy, and he's a property investor himself. And he put a post on socials this week saying he's selling 2.5 million quid worth of investment property at the moment. He has been in it for a long time. He's got it in his personal name, etc., etc. And he's quite an open-minded, forward-thinking sort of character. And he was saying, but this is where it's at the moment. I've got no appetite for it. I don't enjoy it anymore. The margins are getting crushed, and on the back of it, there's been a nice uplift in capital growth. So it's shortened that time window that I might need to hold a portfolio for to get a great return. And he thinks maybe it will go down. Interest rates obviously are going up. None of us can argue with that. A big piece in the supplement today is about, I'm always big on small probability, but meaningful, not nearly no chance, but small probability, but high activity or high consequence situations. So I wouldn't include like fire in property as one of those, because that's more like minute probability, significant consequence, and you simply insure and take sensible steps, and then you don't spend once a week. You don't have a meeting about fire risk across your portfolio or whatever. You know, that you set that aside really. But I see a very much non-zero probability of the base rate overshooting, say 4% in this current cycle that we're in. And no one's really talking about that at the moment. And I think sort of 4 is about the number at which the sensitivity to another 0.25 or 0.5 goes from about here to about here.
Yeah.
And it will be parabolic. People don't really know. It might be a linear path of putting the base rate up, but it will be parabolic at a certain point, because my argument is since the Mortgage Market Review 2012, the vast majority of mortgages that have been written in the residential market have been stress tested at 5.5%. So whether the people have put the money aside because they haven't paid 5.5% or paid their mortgages down, of course, 10 or 20% of people will have done that. You know, another percentage of people will have moved on in their careers and will be earning more money and all the rest of it. But on the flip side, there'll be 10 or 20% that have just spent every penny they've always had, like they always have done. And there'll be some whose situations and circumstances have deteriorated, not improved. Yeah. Right? So the housing market kind of splits into two in terms of everything that's happened. Not 50-50. I think there's more in a good position than a bad position. But as soon as that rate hits 4 and then the pay rate hits 5.5, if it starts to go to 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5, those changes are material. And that's what could cause a suppression in prices, because that's in the wider retail market. So because people have been talking, oh, there's a crash coming, like they do, doom and gloom, yawn, 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 everything's going to hell in a handcart, whatever. There's no shape around it. You know, what I'm trying to do this week is put a bit of shape around that and say, okay, so here's one of the triggers you might need to look for. Again, you go back to The Big Short, as I like to talk about whenever I get the opportunity, obviously, and you look at like Michael Burry's logic. It was unarguably sound, but it still needed the trigger. And what he didn't understand and what he didn't know at the time is what the trigger was. And coming up to almost every economic event of significance, there still needs to be a trigger. Now, the trigger could be the energy price cap thing, but I think from what we've said, we're probably thinking something's going to happen to mean that isn't the trigger. Doesn't mean there isn't another trigger. Doesn't mean there isn't a China suddenly decide it's time to go into Taiwan or whatever, right? But you don't normally see the trigger coming quite so well, or even the timing of the trigger. And that's still the key event that we're always waiting for, I suppose.
But don't you think like the trigger, sometimes it takes 2 years to notice that was a trigger?
I think you can always see the trigger in hindsight, absolutely, yeah. And that's the thing. That's the thing.
Well, if that was the case, Keir Starmer would have tattooed on his forehead by now.
Speaking of tattoos,
yeah, I mean, look, this may sound bad, but I mean, in most of these kind of economic situations, when it's really, really dire and you've got a lot of kind of conflict going on in the world, a good war does tend to flush a lot of this stuff out. That's not asking for one, but, you know, governments are never normally as profitable as they are than when they drum up a bit of cash for some guns. And there's a couple of excuses for it at the moment, isn't there?
You know, the one thing that Truss says that I think made sense but doesn't make sense now, it would have made sense 18 months ago, was around the pandemic bond issue kind of idea, where it would have been, you know, that talk of never waste a good crisis. Yeah. And again, this comes back to architecture. I think even when you're a front bench minister, you're under so much pressure every single day. There's no strategy. So who is the strategic lead in this country? You know, obviously at one point, I suppose technically it was probably Dominic Cummings, although you'd probably say he was more the tactical lead than the strategic lead, right? Is it Graham Brady at the moment, who chairs the 1922? I don't know who the strategic lead is, but it doesn't come from the Prime Minister. And so you know, if you think about how you go back to sort of Musk's example, or I think we've skirted on it before about Dalio. You know, how does Bridgewater Associates work? It's a meritocracy, and it's a very deliberate, constructed, not artificial, but it takes a pretty tough person to work there, just as it does in something like investment banking or whatever, right? Because if you want a meritocracy, you've got to be able to say to me, and I've got to be able not only to take it, but I've got to be able to take it constructively and take it on board. Adam, you talk too much, or Adam, you talk too much bollocks about the economy, or whatever, you know. And then I need to change and get better. And democracy and governments don't work on meritocracy. In fact, they're almost inverse meritocracies, which is a terrible thing. The person who can speak the most bullshit raises to the top. That's the way it's worked over the last 7 or 8 years in the US and the UK, and it's still working like that, right? So how do you take the best parts of, because you know the market solves things better than any other methodology, right? So how do you take how the market would do it and apply that to, right, we need an energy strategy, an infrastructure investment strategy, a defense strategy, and all of these things. And you need to be able to do that the whole time for your job, not get bogged down in, okay, it's COVID, or we haven't got enough beds because it's winter in the air. You have to not be able to do that and step back and go, right, okay, here's a 40-year solution. And it's probably the same conversation as my strategy consultancy interview. Nobody cares about that. But just because they don't care doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at it, because that's the future. That's how you get from lurching from crisis to crisis, which is what seems to be going on at the moment. You know, in many ways, they have wasted the good crisis that was the pandemic, because they haven't gone, actually, you know what, we need 500 billion to rebuild the national grid, the rail infrastructure, the road infrastructure, and something else. And we're going to do that over the next 20 years with these pandemic war bonds to show us a return over the next 100 years. But they didn't do that. Instead, they're too busy trying to save money here to spend money over here. And even though they're probably saving on the wrong stuff and spending on the wrong stuff anyway, it's the bigger underinvestment piece. We need a blank piece of paper approach to, right, we've taken over the UK. It was distressed. We bought it at 63p in the pound, right? The cash flow is 2 trillion a year in terms of GDP, right? So we know we've got a good business here, right? Underlying, we've got a good business, right? How do we then refinance it at 3 trillion? Because we know, you know, say cash flow is 2 trillion a year. Say it's worth 20 trillion, yeah, right? How do we get it to be worth 35 trillion and then take a mortgage and then move away and sweat it? That's what we need to do. So that's my pitch. I'm running for PM. That's it. I've had enough.
Nice one. Well, there is only one fan of you. I think the guy in the car is you.
Quite lively.
Yeah, and been quite a lot of comments. Edwinas was very active on the YouTube chat. So what should be for borrowers? Not sure what this was relating to exactly. But there's comments about the repossession, increased cost of living. Everyone's saying the rates will drop down.
Well, I mean, on that point, yeah. But I mean, what you're going to see, again, the data is going to be massively skewed because there was a 12-month kibosh on that. So anything you see coming in for the next year and a bit is going to be front-loaded by a complete backlog. But I 100% agree. But I mean, it'll be very difficult to figure out unless you can get banking data on, these are people that fell into trouble here, and these are people that have only recently fallen into trouble, and then you have to aggregate between the two. It'll be difficult, but a statistician somewhere will either look at it and publish it or not. But yeah, definitely that's been sitting on the frying pan for a while, sadly.
I think the point around, you know, everyone's saying this, that, or the other. I don't think everyone is saying that. I think maybe mainstream are saying things like that. The only way rates will go down, I mean, down to zero or even negative, which is not impossible either, don't get me wrong, is if we have a really significant and deep recession. and a really negative economic event. If we kick the can down the road another several years, decade, whatever, you're not going to see those rates come back down to where they were. We're going to be in a world of 2 to 3% will be the sort of targeted norm. But if inflation is more persistent on an ongoing basis, unless they raise the inflation target, which is something that I talked about, a weapon in the armory today, you will see higher rates. So I think the worst thing you could do is, what I'm trying to do is lay out a number of possible scenarios. Yeah. And what should concern you is the gap between those possible scenarios. And at the moment, the gap between them is huge. So in 2 years' time, if you said the base rate was minus 0.75%, or you said the base rate was 4.25%, 2 years from today, neither of those would massively surprise me. They're the sort of tails of where I think it could be. But there's a 5% differential. If you went back 3 years and said to me, what's the base rate in 3 years' time? I'd have said to you between 0.5 and 1.5 probably. And I'd have been wrong because it's 1.75 today. So, it would have been outside of, but the point is it would have been a 1% range, not a 5% range. Yeah. So volatility is key. Fixed price debt is fantastic when you've got an inflationary scenario. And I've done a couple of worked examples today in the supplement about why that is. But in a really simple level, if you've got £1 million in cash and £10 million in fixed price debt, and inflation is 10%, your £1 million cash is only worth 900 next year, but your 10 million debt is only worth 9 million. So you've still made a net gain of 900,000 real pounds from that inflation. So it favours you when you've got more debt than you've got cash. Then the key is to control the debt. And, debt sinks everybody or whatever. It's just fundamentally not true. Look at the corporates. Look at the biggest companies in the world. Look at what percentage debt they carry. Yeah. Look at what the big property funds do, the REITs, the commercial property funds, etc. They carry debt. Why do they do it? Because it increases their return on equity, because it allows them to leverage up, right? So again, it's mathematics. It's learning from what other people do. I'm not inventing the wheel here. I'm just listening to what they do and trying to replicate it.
Nice one. It's the chat is super lively today with some other comments, and James is saying that Elon must be using this justification for having 101 children with 3 or 4 different women.
Those who can do, those who can't preach. Again, he's a polarizing character, isn't he? That's hilarious, James.
They can leave out of Boris's book.
Yeah, they're both doing their bit.
Attempting to repopulate the earth is their own personal
with their own, Genghis Khan style. It's like half of Asia supposed to be related to Genghis Khan.
Nice one, cool. And one more comment from Venus. Cannot say there's inflation of energy. It's just lack of energy in Europe.
Well, inflation is driven by supply and demand to an extent, especially in this situation. So there is a problem with supply. And again, that's one of the points that I've made today around oil specifically, but it's not just oil, it's all sorts of different types of energy. There's a lack of kinetic energy, I suppose, at the moment in terms of fossil fuels. And that lack could be much bigger than just Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's like where I live in Portugal, like there's actually I got a letter a month ago saying that my electricity prices are changing and they're going down by 3%, and they haven't been that like high up anyway. But it's because like Portugal's got so much of the renewable energy, and also they've got the pipelines from like Africa and Nigeria and like all the other countries that most of the Europe don't have access to, because they're basically Portugal and Spain are connected with pipelines and stuff.
Yeah. Geographical advantage. Yeah.
But Russia kind of, when they were selling whatever gas to the rest of the Europe, they requested conditions that there will be no pipelines between Spain and France, because that's what connects the rest of the Europe to all that cheap energy from other places. So I do agree. It's a kind of effect of that Russia and all this lack of energy coming from there, lack of supply coming from there, because in other countries it's not as visible.
That's interesting.
So one of the things actually, my landlord in this flat is someone who works for one of the major energy companies in Portugal, and what he's saying is that they're working now on this big pipeline between like Spain and France and Portugal that would connect to like the one of the biggest kind of ports for gas in Portugal, and that's going to be for gas, but it's going to be made in such a way that it will be able to transport hydrogen as well, because Portugal's got a lot of natural energy, natural kind of generate a lot of electricity through renewable energy, and what they can use that electricity for is use it to create hydrogen, and then hydrogen then can be pumped to Rotterdam, and Rotterdam then transports it to all over Europe. So it's Europe is quite well connected, but not like to the main bits.
So not only the tax reasons, but energy security reasons to move to Portugal. I like it.
Yeah,
There's a lot of people going at the moment, isn't there? Yeah.
Guys, I'm going to have to shoot off, so I'm going to have to leave it early this week, but I'm leaving you guys to it if that's okay.
Nice one.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Take care.
He missed the comment saying that he's got a vote for Adam for PM.
Oh,
Yes, that was a comment from LinkedIn. We get comments from all over the place today. Very good. And Joanna is tagging some people in. It's great, and saying hydrogen is the future. Possibly, it's got potential, but whether that potential will be unleashed is another thing, right? Cool. Okay. What's next?
Yeah, what's next? Well, I'm looking at a green energy solution for my home. So I'm looking at getting maybe 10 to, well, definitely a minimum of 10 solar panels. I'm in kind of like a bit of a corridor, like down right at the back of my garden. There's a park, and there's like a clear channel, no trees, nothing. So it's very windy as you come straight up and across past the house. So there's always a breeze, there's always wind. It's really nice in the summer. But I was thinking you can get these wind turbines for like £300, and I was thinking I could just put one at like the rear corner of my garden, and then have that plugged into everything else. So I've got quotes. I'm getting quotes from people who are going to put in the solar panels. They're going to put in a hot water converter, so it will convert the energy from hot water. I've got a fairly new boiler, which is like A++++, something like that. And I'm just thinking here, it will be a decent cost, maybe like 10 or 15,000, like with all of it included and fitted and structured and all that kind of stuff. But they were saying like the first year there's marginal reductions in your cost, but the second year it really starts to show.
yeah.
I think if I'm here for another 5 to 7 years, which is that's at least 5 years is likely to be the case, then energy impact on the home could be reduced drastically. But I was thinking there has to be a value going forward for having these green solutions built into your property, right? Because anyone who's looking at home is looking at how much it's going to cost me to run this home, council tax, energy, broadband. You start thinking about the wider circle once you get your mortgage in principle and you know how much you have to pay the devil every month. I'm thinking it should be pretty decent. So that's a current focus of mine. It's a little project.
So do you need planning permission for the 300-foot great big white wind turbine?
No, it's a micro turbine. I'll send you the link.
We have them in Malta. Very popular in Malta.
You can buy it on I've got it in my Amazon basket. Like I've just got it sitting there. So there's actually two. There's one called Lechnical, Lechnical. That's £388. And then a Zwinner, a Z-Winner windmill generator. If anyone wants the links, I can put them in the chat. But I've not got one yet. They're just solutions that I'm looking at, so they may not work at all.
John Paolo's got a comment saying friend of mine installed one in Italy on the windy part of the coast. It was meant to generate 3 kilowatt hours in normal conditions, but only gets 100 watt hours, so like 30 times less.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah, so I mean, because I kind of thought it would be like an auxiliary thing, right? You know, it's the thing is in the UK, if it's not sunny, it's grey and windy. So
Yeah.
I was kind of looking at something to kind of hedge the bets, just
Yeah,
just
like
a little
that.
bit.
All bases covered.
But yeah, I mean, because we've got the electric vehicle as well. Part of the solution I'm looking at is that they actually put in one of the electric vehicle recharges as well. And then I saw an advert earlier on today. I mean, this is the kind of chat Adam loves, so it's a shame he's gone. But I saw an advert today where there's an electric charging company that is approaching businesses to offer them an additional income revenue stream. So they're basically saying, if you've got car parking space in your car park or wherever, if you give us 5 or 6 bays to put in our chargers, we will give you 30% of the charge revenue.
Ooh.
Which I thought was actually really very interesting.
Yeah.
Really good. I think it seems like one of the most progressive ways to get a charging network around the country. But I thought that was really very interesting. So there seems to be some real movement in that direction.
Nice. Yeah, it's like a thing with those things. You need to kind of really think about how this thing actually gonna work, and maybe speak with people that have got this, because it's there's a lot of companies promising lots of things, right? But they're all based on assumptions, and you always have to check what those assumptions are and how they're gonna actually apply to your personal circumstances, even like to that. Like there's always going to be risk, but like the more you speak to people who've got those things, the more you're able kind of like to be confident that this is going to do what you want it to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the. I'm probably going to reach out and talk to Adam about it, because I know that he's invested decent amounts into his home for the sustainable energy thing. So I thought it'd be worth it. But the other question I kind of thought, I was like, well, how do I know if this is going to be beneficial for me? Do I have to is there like a daylight per annum survey, like a geographical survey they can do to like how much sunlight has been in this part of the world over the year with this kind of rainfall or whatever, or how windy is it? Like, do you need those kind of surveys to check the viability of putting those things on your roof? And but coming back to your point, Helen, I'm probably going to have to find out whether you do need some kind of permissions to put the solar up, and even to put the micro turbine up. So
I think if it's with the turbine, if you could take it down, then probably not, right? But
yeah, I think if it counts as a temporary kind of structure, and I think they are really, aren't they? Even the solar, it's not like if it was solar tiles or something like that where they're fixed to the building, that's probably different. But these are probably going to be affixed rather than a fixture of. But yeah, always get the advice before you do anything like that.
There's a proposal out in Malta at the moment. It's very controversial. I mean, you'd have thought they'd have been well ahead of the game on solar, wouldn't you? But whatever. But to convert a significant portion of agricultural land to basically stick solar panels on it, but then you've lost that agricultural land forever. So there's a real kind of fight going on.
It's one of those landscapes where there's kind of like a lot of like rock faces and mountains and things like that, where if you have solar pointed at the right angle, you probably wouldn't have to have a great deal of impact on the agriculture, considering it's a couple of islands-ish.
That's it. There must be just so many existing places. Well, there is, but that don't have it already. I don't know why you'd need to stick it in a field, is my personal take on it. But
I
honestly,
imagine
with
there's
the
probably
amount,
some conservationists saying, "Oh, this type of ant lives on this type of rock on this cliff face here, so you can't." And there's validity to that, of course, but it's yeah.
but even on the buildings, you'd think it would be like on every single building. It's really not. Which is it's a no-brainer to me. Maybe they haven't offered the right incentives, and Adam's talked about that stuff before. Or maybe it's too expensive, or maybe they haven't understood don't want to pay up front, haven't understood the future proofing of energy prices. But if Malta really invested in that, God, we could fuel most of Europe, the amount of sunshine we get.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve's got an interesting comment. So Google's got this project Sunroof that calculates solar saving potential for your house.
Oh.
I'm
You
just
go,
typing
Jeff.
it down. I'm going to check that
Good
out.
info.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Good
Yeah, I think if anyone can do it, Google can do it for sure, or should do it, because they've got all the 3D images of every house in the world.
Yeah.
Really good, really good. It's a very interesting chat for the future thinking. Brilliant. Anything else you want to cover today, or wrapping up?
Any more questions?
I haven't seen any more questions from the chat, and apart from those ones we covered.
That was a rather lively call. We're almost at the hour. But yeah, I was trying to think. There was something I mentioned earlier on. I think Adam went on a real track with it, and I forgot to say something else that I thought would have been interesting, but it's left me sadly. So there's probably no point in actually saying any of that out loud. No, none at all.
It's okay, Jay. It's good to say it in case it comes back.
Yeah, maybe I was trying to start the engine there. Turn the ignition on. That didn't work at all.
Oh, that's good. All right. Well, let's come back to it next week, and hopefully, whatever you wanted to say is gonna return. And thanks everyone for tuning in and commenting. And nice to see you. Nice to see all the faces there. Take care, guys.
Have a great day, guys.